So my name is Brian King. I work at the Eclipse Foundation. I'm the community manager for our Cloud Dev Tools working group. So the ECD you see in the title of this event stands for Eclipse Cloud Development. This is the first edition of our Tool Time webinar series. A little bit more about the working group. It's a vendor neutral group of organizations who come together to further open source cloud development tool projects that we have at Eclipse. Our mission is to define and build an ecosystem of best-in-class open source web and cloud-based development tools, and to promote and drive the broad adoption of these tools. So I'm delighted that Jonas Helming of Eclipse Source is here for the first edition. Dr. Helming is the general manager of Eclipse Source Munich, as well as a consultant, trainer, and software engineer. His focus is on tools, IDEs, modeling, web-based tools. Jonas is an active member of the Eclipse community and chair of the marketing committee for ECD Tools working group. He's the lead of 2 Eclipse projects and is involved in many others, such as Theia, EMF Cloud, and Eclipse GLSP. In 2013, he won the Eclipse Top Newcomer Evangelist Award, and he regularly speaks at conferences such as JAX, OOP, WJAX, and EclipseCon. And today, Jonas is going to talk about the differences and the commonalities to put them all into context between Eclipse Theia, Che, Eclipse Che, and VS Code. So I'll hand it over to you, Jonas. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Could you give me a quick hand sign that you hear me? Because I don't have any feedback for that.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Thank you for the introduction and welcome from my side to wherever you are. So we have 27 people here. That's great. Thank you for joining the talk today. So yeah, I'm Jonas, working for Eclipse Source. What we do at Eclipse Source is designing and implementing tools in various domains for different customers. And in that role, we are also very heavily involved in technology decisions. So we help our customers in like choosing the right technology for whatever tool chain they want to implement. And in our days, there are 3 technologies, or more precisely ecosystems, that are very interesting, especially when migrating existing tools to the web, or when even like implementing new tools in the web and in the cloud. There are many technologies there, but like 3 are, I would say, are the most important, or the most prominent ones, and that's Eclipse Theia, Eclipse G, and the VS Code ecosystem. And there is also a lot of confusion around those projects because they have some overlap. They're pretty huge. They're very powerful. So the goal of my talk today is actually to compare them, to bring those 3 things into context, to explain them. What are those technologies? What is their role? What can you do with them? And what are the differences? Now, the time we have for this talk is obviously not enough to like provide you all details about those 3 technologies. I could easily probably speak a week about that. However, I hope I can provide you a good overview and give you some initial pointers. There are also great reads out there and other information of sources, and I'm very happy to take any questions. So I will probably not, or I will definitely not fill up the full 60 minutes with my talk. I want to leave a lot of room for questions. So if you have any specific question about your project or about any of those technologies, we have room at the end. All right, let's quickly look at the agenda. Now, when we look at those 3 things, we actually have to build pairs of those technologies that we actually can compare. So because, for example, it doesn't really make sense to just compare Theia to Che because they are like not the same thing. So what I want to do is I want to start with a quick introduction or definition what those 3 things are actually, or like divide them into different subcomponents, so to say. And then I want to compare the components that you can actually compare. And that is foremost VS Code with Eclipse Theia, and VS Code Spaces, or GitHub Code Spaces, as it's currently rebranded, with Eclipse G. So those are the main two comparisons I want to do after a quick comparison. And then I want to provide a conclusion. And this conclusion will provide you some hints. I have to disappoint you. It will probably not like finally answer the question for your specific use case, but I hope I can provide you good directions to find the perfect decision for your own project. All right, so let's start with Theia and VS Code. And for VS Code, there are already different things that I will explain in a second. So there's not just VS Code, there's also VS Code Online, which is part of the GitHub Code Spaces offering. It's an online version of VS Code. And there is the product that you can actually download. Plus there's an open source project backing that up. So let's look a little bit more in detail on what we are actually comparing. And let's start with the probably most well-known thing. What is VS Code? And I'm now talking about the thing that you can actually just download and install, like the tool VS Code. So VS Code is an extensible code editor. It's an IDE. It actually initially called itself Code Editor rather than IDE because it has reduced a lot the jitter that you have that you had in IDEs and you're used to from the desktop. It's heavily focused on keyboard commands. It has a really strong usability concept. It is based on web technology, so it is a great look and feel. By default, it's deployed via Electron, so it's still a desktop app, but it's written in TypeScript and HTML. And it has kind of reinvented the way we do usability in code editors and tools. So it's really a great thing. It is free of charge, so you can download it and use it for free. It is built on open source. The thing that you download, so the downloadable VS Code product itself is not open source. There are some parts in this download that are actually proprietary, and the final license of the thing that you download is a proprietary license that allows you to use it for free, but it's not strictly open source. However, most of the things that are in VS Code are open source, and we come to that a little bit later more in detail. One of the core strengths of VS Code is it provided a very efficient and very easy to use extension model right from the start. And there are nowadays literally thousands and thousands of extensions available. So for any task that a developer wants to fulfill in his or her code editor, you find the fitting extension from the marketplace. And that's really super great. And it's very easy to install them and to use them. And yeah, I mentioned that it's a downloadable desktop tool. That's what it is. All right, now what is the VS Code project? I already mentioned that term, and we have to differentiate that a bit. I told you that VS Code is a downloadable product built on open source, free of charge, but proprietary product license. For example, one thing that is added there is some telemetry extension, which is not open source, that sends some user data. Now, the VS Code project is the open source project, which is the base of VS Code. So Microsoft decided to open source almost all the technology that is part of VS Code, which is really great. So it's available for free. You can use it in other tools too, and we will look at examples for that today. It has a very active development speed and innovation. So there are really a lot of committers there, most of them like from Microsoft. And this project has driven some core innovations in the IDE market in the last years, all foremost the language server protocol, which allows you to decouple the language logic from a client that is used in VS Code, but also in other tools. The debug adapter protocol and other innovations. The Monaco code editor, for example, that's the text editor that is embedded in VS Code. All those things have been developed in the VS Code project. So it's really really good source of innovation. As mentioned, it's mainly driven by Microsoft if you look at the commits, but there are also a lot of contributors. So the fact that Microsoft puts so much effort in that, we shouldn't hide there are also other contributors. However, the majority of the effort is done by Microsoft, which is great. I mean, we can benefit from this, that Microsoft puts so much effort into this project. And now it is not like only open source on a piece of paper, it's actually real open source, and you can always tell that this is the case if there are some adopters, meaning that there are some other projects that adopt the code and use it in some other context, because that's kind of the goal. Okay, you can use it for your own project. And there's, for example, VS Codium, which is another deployment of VS Code, which is fully open source. So it doesn't have this proprietary extensions in it. The other example is Eclipse Theia, and I will talk about the details a little bit later. So as you can see, it's not just it's real open source. It is actually allowed. It's released under the MIT license, so you can use components of VS Code or full Visual Studio Code in another context. Now, what is VS Code Online? I've put that in the name VS Code Online is officially not there anymore. It was announced when the first online offering of Microsoft was released the end of last year as part of Azure. So you can still start online development workspaces on Azure. And the tool that was embedded there, which is an online version of VS Code, was originally branded VS Code Online. The brand has disappeared, so it's probably kind of merged or will be merged into GitHub Codespaces. But I would call the thing like the online IDE, the online version of VS Code Online, just for the sake of simplicity and that you understand what I'm talking about. Now, it is an online version of VS Code hosted in either VS Code Codespaces, which is the offering embedded into Azure, or GitHub Codespaces, which is kind of the very similar offering embedded in GitHub, currently running in a restricted beta. And it is exactly the same as VS Code, but only running in the browser. That means the underlying runtime, meaning where the compiler is executed, where the code is, like all the business logic of the IDE is running in a container on a remote server, and you only access the UI via a browser. Now, that the appearance of VS Code Online is actually not surprising, because if you look at the architecture of VS Code desktop version, all the innovations like web-based, the protocols and everything, they kind of prepared the whole architecture for the move to run online, essentially. So this is just the logical next step. So it runs in the browser. It's currently bound to Azure or GitHub. It is not open source at the moment, so you don't find the implementation of VS Code Online in the VS Code project at the moment. There were some discussions about that, but to my latest state, that's not open source. So the only way to use this currently is either use Azure and like VS Code Codespaces, or GitHub Codespaces, which is currently released in a restricted beta. I was so lucky to try it. It's pretty cool. You just on the GitHub repository, you can just click on any branch code and it opens the IDE in the browser and you're ready to go. Now, what is Eclipse Theia on the other end? Now, Theia is itself not per se a tool. It's rather a platform, and by definition, it is an open source platform for building web-based tools and IDEs. So in this sense, it's more like the project. The VS Code project. It is not like exactly the same as VS Code. It's not something you can directly download. The goal is rather to be the basis for you to implement some tools, whether those tools be domain specific or adapted coding, or maybe they have nothing to do with code at all. So these are all the targets of Eclipse Theia. Theia supports both local and cloud online deployment. So it actually kind of did what VS Code is doing now since a year or so. It supported this case right from its inception, like 3 years ago. It kind of used the innovation of the HTML-based client and the protocols and directly made the online case happen. So if you build a tool based on Theia, you can actually deploy it either local as a desktop application via Electron, or remotely and access it via a browser. Theia has a very modular and flexible architecture. We will go into this a little bit more in detail, but it is definitely even more flexible than the VS Code one. And that's important because it really wants to be a platform and not only support the code editor use case, but go beyond that and also support like full branding, white labeling, and very tools that are not necessarily close to the usability of something that is already there. And the Eclipse Theia project is open source, and it's hosted at the Eclipse Foundation, so it's hosted at a vendor-neutral organization. Now, I talked about platform and product a lot, so let's compare this a bit. So VS Code is a downloadable product. It is for free, but it's still a product. It's something that you can download, click, and directly use. Now, VS Code Online is a product that is embedded in Azure and GitHub. And Theia is now a platform to build tools. So at the moment, you cannot just download Theia, although it is very simple to just start your own product based on Theia. That's not a long task. You just need to define what's in. But essentially, the real use case is that you build something on top of that. And there are a couple of examples out there. For example, a tool called Theia. That is the IDE that the Eclipse G project provides by default. So if you use G, which is an online workspace system, G comes with a default IDE that is based on Theia, and this IDE is called Theia. It's pretty much like very vanilla Theia, just adding a few extensions and customizing it a bit, and then you have a custom tool, which is the perfect use case for Theia. Another good example is Gitpod. That's an online IDE service. I will talk about that a little bit more in detail later. Again, it's very similar in a sense to GitHub code spaces. It also provides an integration with GitHub, but also GitLab and Bitbucket. And the idea is, again, you can just on an arbitrary repository or branch, basically click a button or just a certain URL that you need to type, and then you directly get an online workspace where you can start to code. And Gitpod also uses Theia for that. So it adapted the platform to provide its own Theia version, so to say. Another example that is available open source is the Youngster tooling for tool support for a domain-specific language called Young. And there are many more. So we can currently observe a strong trend of companies adopting Theia to build some domain-specific tools in various domains and areas. So the project is now really in a state that where it gets heavily adopted, especially for slightly custom tools that are a little bit different than just default IDEs. Eclipse Theia does not provide a vanilla download yet, although that is currently on the way. So hopefully very soon you will be able to go to the Theia website and just download an installer with the default Theia version. That was heavily requested by the community because it makes it very easy to just consume Theia and use it. So that's currently on the way. Currently, the easiest way probably to try Theia is Gitpod because it's also free of charge until you have a certain amount of hours that you can use. So that's currently by far the easiest way to just try out Theia vanilla. Now let's talk about a little bit on the connection of those projects, because I mentioned that they reuse each other a bit. Now the basis of everything is the VS Code project. It provides a lot of technologies and components that are used by other projects. And the most obvious users of the VS Code project are VS Code and VS Code Online. They're fully based on the VS Code project and add a little bit on top. In this diagram, blue basically means that something is directly consumable. I made Eclipse Theia light blue because it doesn't directly provide a download, although it is like a 1-minute task to basically start Theia. So if you Google for how to launch Theia, you find very easy ways to basically start your own version of Theia. So it's not as complicated as setting up a full build for an Eclipse product that you used from the past. However, Eclipse Theia then itself is a platform again, and then there are those products that are based on Eclipse Theia, and some of them are open source, some not. And this is kind of the primary use case of Theia. So it adds a little bit to the VS Code technology, or not only a little bit, but it adds something, and then itself is a platform for building tools. All right, let's start with the comparison between Theia and VS Code. There would be like hundreds of criteria where you could compare. I restricted a little bit to the most interesting ones. And the first one is extensibility and adaptability. That means how can you extend the platform? How can you adapt it? How can you change things? How can you add features to a tool based on the respective technology? Now, there are two mechanisms for this, essentially. VS Code has the extension model called VS Code extensions, and Theia has an extension model that is called Theia extensions. Now, let's start with VS Code. The way that the extension model of VS Code works is VS Code provides a defined API, and you can write plugins that use this API to basically influence how the tool behaves. So you can add menu entries, you can hook into events, like for example on file save. You can add compilers, you can add language servers to add support for new languages. You can add new views, like all those extension use cases that you probably want in a code editor are provided by this API. VS Code extensions run in a separated, isolated process. So that's pretty good if you have a lot of them, so they cannot really harm the stability of the tool. And they can be installed at runtime. So if you open the marketplace, you can just install them while VS Code is running, and after a quick download, they're actually ready to go. And probably most of you have used this mechanism before. It's very simple, very efficient. Now, the only problem with this approach is it is actually focused on this extension use case. That means the tool is there, it's defined, and you want to add something. But only the things that are supported in this API are actually, you can actually extend or add to a tool. The advantage of this approach is obviously the API is like reduced. It's very simple to use, and it's very obvious that this was a good idea because the amount of available VS Code extensions shows that this approach is very efficient. Like, it's very simple to create those extensions, although there are limitations. So for example, if you want to remove existing stuff, like you want to remove all the default menus, if you want to completely white label something, if you want to add like very complicated views, so there's some limitations on what you can do with this extension model. Now, Eclipse G, on the other hand, has extensibility kind of built in the core. And how this works is in Eclipse Theia, everything, including the core platform, is a Theia extension. So there is no difference between something that you add and something that's already there. Everything is in Theia is in Theia extension, and those extensions communicate via dependency injection. So this model is very flexible because you can, if you write your own Theia extension, you can basically do whatever the core platform can do. So you can access all API that is available inside. You can override stuff via dependency injection, and you have a lot of different ways to customize and adapt the tool that you're building. Of course, there are always some limitations on what you can do. However, with this approach, it's kind of the maximum extensibility you can get. At the end of the day, it's still open source, so if something cannot be adapted with the existing mechanism, you can still change it. But it is very flexible because it's this modular concept has been kind of built in from the core and from the beginning. Now, the advantages of the Eclipse extension model is the things that you can do with it. So it's very powerful. It's much more comprehensive than the plugin API or the VS Code extension API. The disadvantages are two. One, it is more complex to do, so you need more knowledge because there's not this one defined API, but basically you can access everything. I mean, there is documentation there too, but it is definitely more complex to do something. And in turn, the result you can achieve is also more powerful. Second disadvantage is you cannot install those extensions at runtime. And that's not really the use case. So the use case of Theia extensions is rather build something as a product, configure it, and then deploy it, rather than like letting developers install something new. I have a comment that I have an echo. Is that still the case? Okay, then probably on your end. Now we have those two extension models, and they both have advantages and disadvantages, like flexibility versus simplicity, runtime installation versus full access to all APIs. Now, it would be very hard to compare those two extension models and like declare the winner, but there is one missing detail. Now, because there are so many extensions for VS Code already available, and because the VS Code extension model has some advantages over the Theia extension model, Eclipse Theia, or more precisely Red Hat, actually decided to support the same extension model in Theia 2. And how the way this works is there is a Theia extension that you can install into your product or make part of your product, and this extension provides the same API that VS Code does. And with this, you can actually use VS Code extensions in Theia 2, and you can install them at runtime. This is actually great because that provides access to all those great existing VS Code extensions that are out there. And it also allows you to use the advantages of the VS Code extension model, for example, simplicity and installation during runtime. Now with that, it becomes clearer because Theia has both. Like it has the powerful one for like white labeling, branding, like building your completely custom product, plus the VS Code extension model for easy and installation at runtime. And with that, we have to declare Theia for the winner here. This is actually no surprise. Like this extensibility and adaptability was one of the core motivations to incept Theia initially. So it would be like, this is not a surprise that Theia is even more powerful than VS Code here. Now let's look at the available extensions that you can actually install or use in both platforms. Now, there is one interesting detail. So the VS Code extensions, there is a marketplace for them where you can browse them and download them. And probably most of you know that. And there are like 10,000s and thousands of extensions available there. Now, there's one problem with that. I just told you that Theia actually supports VS Code extensions. And so you could install them from there. But the terms of use of the existing VS Code marketplace do not allow to install extensions to anything else than VS Code. So you're actually not allowed to install them in Theia. Now, to solve that problem, Typefox incepted a open source project called OpenVSX Registry that fulfills the same role as the Visual Studio Code marketplace. But the marketplace is fully open source, and it has less restrictive terms of use that allow to install the hosted extensions to any tool. For example, Theia, but also, for example, VS Codium. So any extension that is hosted at OpenVSX can be installed to literally any location. Now, this is currently, so the marketplace is already implemented, and it's already online, and it's filling very fast with solutions. So the number I have here on the slide is probably by far outdated right now. So I would say the most interesting extensions are already there. So you probably find what you use daily. And what's also interesting in the marketplace, like the OpenVSX registry is currently transferred to the Eclipse Foundation, and the Eclipse Foundation will host this in a vendor-neutral way in the future. This is one of the initiatives that the Eclipse Cloud Development Working Group is currently supporting. Now with that, I could still claim, okay, there are more extensions for VS Code. Technically VS Code is the winner. However, that will probably change a little bit over time if OpenVSX even fills more. And at the end, it really depends like which extensions you actually need at the end. One detail that is maybe interesting, if you are working in a context where you want to restrict what developers or users of your tool are allowed to install, you can also self-host OpenVSX. So you can install it at your own infrastructure, on your own infrastructure, and then deploy it in-house and only fill it with the solution you want to allow to install to your users. Next criteria, open source. Like how open are the solutions? What about the ecosystem and the vendor neutrality? And again, we're comparing now the VS Code project with the Eclipse Theia project, because in this category, it doesn't make sense to compare the technologies. Now let's look at the VS Code project first. MIT license, that is great. That's kind of the most less restrictive license you can probably wish for. You can like kind of do almost anything. I'm not a lawyer, but like it's very, very, very convenient. It is governed by Microsoft. So there is no like vendor neutral organization behind that. And what does that mean? I mean, they will very likely not just take it away, but they have full control of the rules. So they can decide who can contribute or not. That's it. Whether you like that or not, or whether that's an issue, you have to decide. Now, if we look at the contributors, and there are really a lot of contributions, so it's very active, which is great. If we look at the top 20 contributors, the last time I looked, they all seem to be affiliated with Microsoft, which is not a bad thing. Again, I think it's great that Microsoft puts so much effort into open source. It's really great. However, it is mainly driven by Microsoft. That worked well for other projects too. Like, for example, the Eclipse desktop version was driven by IBM for years before other contributors joined. Just want to mention that. We have like 1.4 million lines of code and 420 active contributors, which is amazing. Now let's compare that to Theia. Theia has the EPL license that also allows for commercial use. It's governed by the Eclipse Foundation and supported by a working group. So that means there are defined rules that are defined by an independent foundation, and everybody basically plays by the same rules. Also, the infrastructure is owned by the Eclipse Foundation, not by a specific company. If we look at the top 20 contributors, we have 6 different companies, so more diversity in the top committers for sure. And we have much less code. That is mainly due to the fact that Theia is reusing so many components from VS Code. So we have to be fair here. Like Theia is definitely depending on VS Code. And we have 110 active contributors, so smaller, but like if we look at the code base, it's kind of comparable. And what's interesting, if we look at the number of or the contributing companies, and we have them down here, we can see the first four companies that are mostly contributing have kind of a very similar commit rate. So it's not that there's this one company that drives everything, but there are really a lot of companies like putting effort in this project, which is kind of the dream for every open source project. So it's really not only driven by one party, but truly open source and diverse. That means a lot of different parties contribute to that. All right, that concludes the comparison of VS Code with Theia, and I want to switch over to VS Code or Visual Studio Code Spaces or GitHub Code Spaces that they're currently changed to. And I compare that to Eclipse G. Now, before we do that, let's quickly look at the what do those projects actually do? And for that, to understand that, we want to quickly look at the architecture of modern tools. Now, I mentioned before that in those remote deployment, or for example in VS Code Online or in Theia, if you deploy remotely, we have a container that runs on a remote location that hosts all the business logic plus the source files, the compiler, a checker, the debugger, basically everything that is headless and that interacts with files and that consumes some computation power. All this stuff in a remote tool in the usual architecture runs in a container on the server, and we call this container a workspace container. And now the browser IDE that is basically only the UI connects to this container. And this is a very common architecture for most online tools nowadays. So the client is kind of only displaying, and everything that needs calculation is done on the server. Now, if you have such a scenario, the interesting question is who basically manages the workspace containers for your developers. Like if a developer starts to work in the morning, They need to log in somewhere, and then they somehow need to decide which projects are they working on, and then there needs to be some component that basically starts the workspace container on the server. And this is the task of a workspace server. So workspace server is basically responsible to host the developer workspaces for your developers. So it's kind of a management for the virtual machines of your developers, if you will. It typically has some sort of dashboard where you can configure which workspaces you have, like you can start and stop them, copy them, share them with other people, and so on. So a little bit like the management of a virtual machine or of virtual machines. Nowadays, it's often based on Kubernetes, but it doesn't have to be. But this is the role of a workspace. Now, what is VS Code Codespaces or GitHub Codespaces? It is a workspace server integrating with VS Code and VS Code Online. Online is, I think, clear. So if you start a GitHub Codespace, you directly get a browser-based IDE. But you also can connect your desktop tool to this online workspace, which kind of visualize your development environments. You can also connect a desktop tool to a remotely running workspace. And this is very nice because all the computation power is on the server, and you can also easily share and reproduce that. It does hosting for you. You can host it on Azure or on GitHub, or probably behind the hosting on GitHub, it's also Azure again, which is currently in beta. And the available IDEs that you can use to connect to the workspaces are VS Code Online, the browser-based, and VS Code, the desktop one. And also Visual Studio Code, in case you want to use that. Now, what is Eclipse G? Also, it is a workspace server that integrates Theia as a default IDE. So it has a very similar feature set. From a hosting point of view, it's more flexible. So you can basically host it on any Kubernetes cluster because so it's completely Kubernetes native. For example, AWS, OpenShift, GCE, Minikube, you name it. Anywhere you want to deploy it, you can deploy Eclipse G as a workspace. The available IDEs, and there it gets interesting. So the default is G Theia. That's a custom Theia version that G provides as a default IDE. However, you can also use other editors in G. For example, VS Codium, like the open source version of VS Code, Jupyter, Classic Eclipse that integrates the desktop Eclipse version running in the browser. IntelliJ has been recently announced. And you can even add your own editors if you're missing something. So you have a lot of flexibility there. Now let's compare those two things. In terms of how you can configure virtual machines and the workspaces. With virtual machines, I basically mean the workspace container on the server. So in VS Code Spaces or GitHub Code Spaces, you have basic options, and you can add an install shell script, which installs the necessary tools you need for development. In J, you have something more sophisticated, which they call stack management. So you can kind of configure and manage stacks that provide a certain template for your development. So, for example, you can say, I want to develop in Java based on Spring Boot with a Postgres database and also TypeScript. And then basically J configures the respective development environment. You can save those, you can share them with others. So it's a little bit more sophisticated compared to GitHub Code Spaces. The available IDEs, as mentioned, in GitHub Code Spaces, we have all the Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio versions. In J, we have J Theia, VS Codium, Jupyter, and you can add your own. In terms of sharing workspaces, in J, you can actually create a one-click URL to onboard new developers. This one-click URL you can share, and then you can configure Git repository to be checked out, plus the respective stack, meaning the workspace configuration that new users get. And with this URL, a new team member can basically just click one link and get everything set up. That's not supported by VS Code, but VS Code supports live sharing. That's pretty cool feature. So you can connect to instances of the tool and then basically do a pair programming session. I haven't tested that myself, but I saw a very interesting talk recently demonstrating this. So this is, I think, a very interesting area for the future to provide good support for remote collaboration on code, essentially. Now, one interesting differentiator is, again, the flexibility. And that's, again, pretty clear because G is, again, kind of a platform. It is, so G is a little bit different than Theia. So you can download and install G, that's kind of foreseen. But also it is, it aims to be the platform for something that you can adapt to your own needs. And as it is open source and it provides a lot of APIs to interact with the system, it supports white labeling and provides a headless API for all its features. And with that, it is actually, for example, pretty easy to integrate G into an existing web page. So, for example, let's assume you already have a online presence for your developers and you want to add those workspace management. You can implement your own web-based UI and run G on the backend to do the heavy work for you. So this is something that is supported with G. GitHub Codespaces or VS Codespaces is essentially a ready-to-use product. So there's no aim to support those custom white labeling use cases at the moment, to my knowledge. And G is open source. VS Codespaces and GitHub Codespaces is not open source. Now, companies contributing to G, that's also interesting. You see that's a pretty long list. So a lot of different companies have been contributed to G, and it's also it is existing for quite a while. I think it was announced in 2015, so it's even older than Theia, and it adopted Theia at a later point. Okay, now this should conclude the comparison. Before I come to the conclusion, I want to mention some other tools that I didn't talk in detail about today, but they're definitely worth mentioning. So there is a product by Red Hat called Code Ready Workspaces. That's the commercial version of Eclipse G. It's fully based on open source, like all Red Hat products, but you can buy professional support for it. Mentioned that. And it is integrated in OpenShift. So if you are interested in OpenShift, you should definitely look at this option because it's very well integrated and, for example, also allows you to deploy the things that developer develop on the same in the same infrastructure. Then definitely Gitpod. Gitpod is also workspace hosting that is very well integrated with GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket. It provides its own Theia-based IDE, like a very slim, very fast one. Gitpod itself is slim and fast. It's very simple to use. I would say very comparable to GitHub Codespaces. And it has been recently open sourced. So if you want to try Theia or basically have a very simple way to develop something online, I definitely recommend having a look at Gitpod. It is a commercial product, so for some things you have to pay. However, they recently open sourced the core, and it's pretty cool offering. Yeah, I mentioned that easiest way to try Theia at the moment. And finally, VS Codium, I mentioned that before. That's the open source build for VS Code. All right, let's come to the conclusion. For the conclusion, I will look at the question like, which is the best technology for you from different personas, because it depends heavily on what you want to do with those tools, which one is the best. And quick disclaimer again, I'm aware that I cannot finally answer those questions for you. These are just directions, hints, and I'm happy to discuss any of your specific questions about that in detail. Okay, as a user, so you just want to use a tool to do development. So VS Code, if you want a downloadable application, VS Code is great. I mean, it has an incredible market share at the moment, and it has it's a great tool. VS Code Online, if you're using Azure or GitHub, then it's a great alternative. If you can make it to the private beta, probably will release that, hopefully soon. Eclipse Theia, if you prefer open tools, so if you care about everything being open source and having no proprietary telemetry, for example, in the tool you use, and if you use any tool that is based on Theia, so for example, if you use G or Gitpod or any other Theia-based tool. GitHub code spaces, if you want to use VS Code online, that's the only way. And if you use Azure or GitHub and you're just fine with the feature set and the login that you have there. Login in terms of, okay, you cannot use anything else. And Eclipse G, finally, if you want to self-host your workspace hosting with flexibility. So you want to have everything under control, install on-premise, and potentially adapt the feature set, then Eclipse G is a good alternative. As an adopter, VS Code, so adopter means basically you use the technology and build something on top of it. VS Code, if you just want VS Code plus a little extension, so you just want to add something to the existing ecosystem, the advantage is VS Code is already known and deployed to like a lot of developers. Theia, if you want to build something custom, potentially white label, and you need more flexibility and you want to build on an open solution. And if you want to build something that is not necessarily fully code-centric, so then you will probably hit the borders on what you can do with VS Code. And if you care about vendor neutrality and the potential login to an existing ecosystem. VS Code, GitHub code spaces. I will not miss one of the two names. I hopefully, there is actually a comment in the chat too. Microsoft announced to drop VS Code code spaces, so it's GitHub code spaces. And VS Code Online. If you run GitHub and Eclipse G, if you want to extend, adapt, integrate, or even white label your workspace hosting and integrate, for example, an existing web presence or whatever existing web page you already have. And again, if you care about vendor neutrality and vendor login. All right. Now, there's one special use case as an extension developer. So let's assume you want to, for example, write an extension to support a new language or as an existing language. So what is the best way then? So there the answer is very simple. If you can, just benefit from the VS Code plugin model, like write a VS Code extension, because it can be then used by users in Theia, but also in VS Code. So that's the perfect way to go. And you can even publish it to 2 locations, to the VS Code marketplace, as you're probably used to, but also consider it to publish it to the open alternative, OpenVSX, because then it's available to all users that are not directly using VS Code, but also other tools like VS Codium and Theia. And with that, I want to conclude this talk and open it up for questions before we actually run out of time at the end. So I'm happy to answer questions right now, as long as we have time. If there are any questions open at the end of this talk, just feel free to get in contact with me. My email is here on the slide. Just drop me an email. I will try to answer as fast as I can. And I'm also always interested in learning about the use cases and the what are the open questions that you have? What are you missing in the ecosystem and so on? So yeah, just ping me on that. By the way, if you want to, I mentioned a lot that you can build, that you can use here to build tools that are not just code-centric. We have one demo available that you can just use without login. That is eclipsesource.com/coffee editor. That's an example for a domain-specific tool with diagrams, form-based editors, like graphical views and so on. So if you're interested in that, just go there and try it out. All right, and now I'm happy to take questions. I haven't observed the chat.
Thank you very much, Jonas. So before we jump into the QA, there are 4 or 5 questions here. I would just like to let everybody know that we will have a poll. So keep an eye on the bottom left of the screen where a green button will appear shortly. And we just love your feedback on this event so that we can make them better moving forward. So how would you like to handle the questions? They're there in the Ask a Question section. Do you want to read them yourself or do you want me to read them out to you?
No, that's perfect. Then I can read them myself. Okay. First question is. Yeah, thank you. First question was, is there a way to control the risk if the decision for the right platform is yet unclear? Yeah, that's a good question, because even if you look at all the criteria, at one point in time, you have to do a decision for one platform. And this has quite some effect on your future development. Now, one mitigation is definitely aiming at VS Code extension wherever possible, because those are compatible with both. The other mitigation is try to separate the business logic or the core implementation of whatever you build from the platform integration, which is actually very feasible. Like, for example, if you implement a very complex UI showing something, implement the UI as one component, and then add a second component that, for example, integrates this with Theia, and keep this very thin. With this pattern, you can actually potentially integrate the same functionality into another platform in the future. So we have several customer projects that apply this, and, for example, either provide features as VS Code extensions to make them available in Theia and VS Code, or, for example, a typical case is implement something integrated in Theia, but also make the same feature set available, a little bit adapted on a plain web page, as an example. For example, to demonstrate something. Yeah. Second question: didn't Microsoft recently ended VS Code Spaces? Yes. Yes. So no VS Code Spaces anymore. GitHub Code Spaces. What about next question is, what about non-centric non-code centric tools such as data centric or graphical editors? Yeah. Are there web-based solutions for these is the question. Yes, there are. And that's very interesting that like in the last years, a lot of additional technologies were incepted that are not only supporting code-based editors or code-centric editors, but also things like diagrams. So, for example, there are two projects at Eclipse, Eclipse Proti and Eclipse GLSP. So Sproti is a diagramming technology, and Eclipse GLSP is based on top of that and allows you to very efficiently implement web-based diagram editors. So pretty much like you used to from the desktop, like GEF. It adapts a very similar model than the language server protocol, but only for graphical editors. So the idea again is to like put as much business logic as possible on the server, where you can even reuse existing code if you have, and then let the client basically render the result. Another example is EMF Cloud. That's another Eclipse project which consists of a lot of components that are aimed at building, let's say, modeling tools or declarative tools or tools for configuration or something. And the link that I just had on the slide shows actually those different technologies in action. How do you see Theia being white labeled? I'm not 100% sure. I hope I get the question correctly. Like what I mean by that, maybe. So there are a lot of use cases where you want to deploy a tool that is, for example, restricted in what you can do with it, that has a custom branding, and that is actually integrated into something. For example, let's say you have a you design a tutorial and you want to provide the users of your tool access to a code editor where you can open different files and like complete exercises, but you don't want to like overload them with the full complexity of all menus or the quick access bar or whatever, but you maybe want just one view on the right side which shows the current exercise. So and then you maybe want another theme, and maybe, I don't know, do not show the file explorer because you don't want to work with files. So it's basically customizing the look and feel to an extreme that you might not even notice anymore that this is Theia, but you could also think, okay, this is just a tool that a certain company developed from scratch. This is what I mean by white labeling. It's basically really adapting the platform to a point where it's fully customized to your specific use case, branding, corporate identity, and look and feel. And did that actually answer the question? Because for this one, I was not 100% sure whether I got it. Cool. All right. Are there any other questions? with that, I would hand it over back to you, Brian. 5 minutes early.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you very much, Jonas. That was a great presentation. So just a reminder for everybody, before you go, please hit the green button down there and give us your feedback. I also urge you to, if you want to continue to find out more about the community and our projects such as Theia and Jay, please follow us on Twitter at ECD Tools. And we also have a LinkedIn page. It's a showcase page under Eclipse Foundation. You'll easily find us if you search ECD Tools. And I'd also like to announce the next edition of Tool Time. We hope to see you there. And it's Distributor VS Code extensions with OpenVSX, which of course Jonas talked about today. And that will be a deep dive into openvsx.org, the OpenVSX project, how to publish your extensions, and so on. So that will be on December the 1st. So watch out for that and sign up early. Thank you for coming, and see you again.